Relations between France and the UK have been tense for some time now. Britain's short-lived Prime Minister Liz Truss even questioned whether French President Emmanuel Macron was really an ally at all. But since Rishi Sunak took up residence in Downing Street, are there signs that perhaps things are improving? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. The UK government has signed a $75 million deal with France to stop asylum seekers crossing the Channel. The new deal is nearly $10 million more than the existing one.
I spoke to President Macron about it when I first spoke to him. I further met with him and we went over it in more detail, and I'm pleased that as a result of that dialogue we now have a new deal with the French, which is going to mean 40% more patrols happening in France, and for the first time our officials embedded in their operations.
The images circulating from COP27 in Egypt certainly showed the duo getting along well. Both Sunak and Macron have plenty in common. Both their fathers were doctors, they're roughly the same age, Sunak being 42 and Macron 44, and they also both worked in investment banking before going into politics. So with their similarities, can Sunak and Macron reset relations between the two countries? From Dresden in Germany, we have Joseph Downing. He's senior lecturer in international relations at Aston University and an expert in French politics. Meanwhile, in Paris, we have Anne-Elisabeth Moutet. She's a French journalist and political commentator. And joining us from Brussels, we have Peter Wilding, who's a political commentator and a special advisor to Conservative MP Tobias Ellwood. So, Joseph, if we can start off with you. France and the islands that we call the United Kingdom these days, they've been more or less the best of frenemies for 1,000 years now. Where is the relationship as we stand today? Are France and England, France and the United Kingdom friends, or are they not?
Well, this is a fascinating question because it really depends on where you look and who you believe. If you believe the public discourse, particularly of the Johnson administration, it was a relationship that was antagonistic and was a result, it was an ongoing discussion around Brexit and us distancing ourselves from the EU. However, if you look a bit more deeply into perhaps what we'd call in political science, kind of the deep state connections between the two countries, you actually see a really quite close relationship on a number of institutional levels that a political leader and his populist rhetoric can't pull apart. I'll give you one example, being that this year, for the first time, the British Army's 1st Division was led by a French brigadier general. And not many people out there know that the British and the French armed forces have agreements where commanding officers rotate between the two states. We could also talk about the fact that during the French nuclear outages this summer, the UK exported electricity to France and is likely, once the nuclear fleet comes back online in France, to import electricity again. So, on the surface, we can see it's a bit of a fractured relationship, but the sort of deeper connections remain. And I don't think we should look too much into, the political discourse when we can look into these bigger kind of institutional and commercial relationships.
Peter, I see a lot of nodding from you there. I'm assuming you agree with that assessment.
Oh, I do agree with that assessment. And I think it's very, very wonderful to hear that. But I don't think the political relationship mirrors the institutional relationship. And I think the institutional relationship, albeit good in security and intelligence terms, in my view, is as chilly as the period of time between the end of the Suez Crisis and the accession of the United Kingdom to the European Economic Community, as it was then in '73. And the reason I feel that is politics does drive stuff. And the tragedy, I think, in the United Kingdom establishment is that there is a political media necessity to follow the diktats of tabloid journalists and to see France as you quite rightly said earlier on, as a frenemy. But in these dangerous times, you can't play politics with your closest security, intelligence, and one-time commercial partner. And so whilst I do agree completely that those who are not prejudiced in their relationship with France because of Brexit, respect their relationships bilateral with the French establishment. And it's just a tragedy, in my view, that we have, since 2016, been in a situation where performative politics has been the order of the day. And I respect the French and German establishments for treating Britain as a spoiled child, yet to come back to the sensible framework of nation-state relations.
And Elizabeth, you actually have an article in the Daily Telegraph from just last month in which you've described the relationship between Sunak and Macron as a budding bromance, even. So where do you stand on this issue? I mean, essentially, this is the issue. We have the institutional relationship between the two countries, which institutionally need one another. They're very nearby. They're very important trading partners for one another. And yet politics always does win out at the end of the day. So how do you see things going?
At the end of the day, politics also matters, because there was certainly a will a few years back at the beginning of Brexit. There was a will to treat Britain harshly. That probably has changed, and one of the reasons is the war in Ukraine, and the other one is the re-election of Emmanuel Macron without a majority in Parliament. And the result also, it coincides with the fact that Rishi Sunak is a character that the French think they understand better than the previous two prime ministers of Great Britain, and that Emmanuel Macron has personalized politics enough that this counts. Rishi Sunak, in many ways, is the British Macron. He's seen as a technocrat. He's seen as a safe pair of hands. He's seen as somebody serious. He's seen as somebody who has a same age, same career, more or less, as Emmanuel Macron. And there's also a feeling in France that we need allies more, because the situation in which Emmanuel Macron believed that he would have a sort of complete control of the political situation, both in France and in the EU, has not worked out so well.
Well, we have a quote here from Jean-Pierre Juillet, who was a former French ambassador to the United Kingdom, in which he says, and I quote, "This relationship can work because they've had similar paths, they see markets in a similar way, and because Macron is a lot more right-wing than he was 5 years ago. They are familiar with the same financial circles, the circles that backed Macron for president." So, Peter, I've got to ask you, to what degree is the warming of relations between France and the United Kingdom down to the fact that Britain's been through two prime ministers, they're now on a third, perhaps this is a change of scene, versus the fact that Emmanuel Macron has moved to the right himself?
Well, in the immortal words of Jeremy Hunt and his interview with British television, I don't respect those figures, as he said, or that point of view. Look, it's a little bit superficial to see Sunak as some kind of bromantic buddy just because they're both with Macron, because they both have investment banking backgrounds, etc. I mean, there the similarity ends. I mean, Macron has established his own political space, his party, his majority, certainly his presidential majority, whereas Sunak is the prisoner of the Conservative Party and the British tabloid media. More importantly, Macron is a big political thinker, and Sunak is not. And so I think that superficial analysis should just be placed in the area called superficial. The second thing to understand is that bromance is unimportant in international relations. Interests matter, not relations, although relations do sometimes assist the development of those interests. Look, Britain and France, after, as you said, 1,000 years of frenemyship, going from the depths of 1453 and the loss of the French provinces for the British crown, English crown, to glory days. And I would say, the relations between Britain and France in Napoleon III third period were good. And that's only because your interests coincide. And up to 2016, you couldn't argue that economically and strategically and in security terms, Britain and France were as close as they've ever been.
And let me just pull in Anne Elizabeth here, if I may. Anne Elizabeth, do you agree with that position or not?
Well, I think it's a very Kissingerian position. I also I can see that seen from afar, the glitter is more attractive, but Macron is not a political thinker. Actually, his entire career was based on saying political ideas on the right and on the left do not exist and are interchangeable whenever they exist and whenever I want it. And he has sort of navigated between the left and the right, sort of with his battle cry during his first successful, wildly successful presidential campaign was en même temps. En même temps in French means at the same time, which means that you can do everything at the same time. And he's seeing the end of that, because when you weaken traditional parties, you make the extremes go up. And so Emmanuel Macron found himself at 8 points of a quasi-fascist leader in the last presidential election, which is not something he should boast about. And he now has in parliament the strongest group apart from the non-majority but plurality he has, is the National Rally group. And after that, you've got the hard left NUPES. He is caught in a situation in which he cannot apply ideas because he doesn't really have theories. He believes in getting things done, but he hasn't got things done. All the things that he promised during his campaign did not happen. And this is also something that reflects a bit in foreign relations, in that he campaigned, and that was an interesting thing. He was the first candidate in France who campaigned with as many European flags at his rallies, at his first campaign, as French flags, as tricolors. That was something that struck everyone. But he has managed to alienate enough leaders within the EU that the probably too frankly expressed desire to become the head of Europe has backfired. And finally, his attitude on Ukraine, which actually is not half as bad as Germany's, is also something that drives a wedge between him and lots of leaders, not just Rishi Sunak, but also the Balts and the Central Europeans.
So, Anne Elizabeth, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it almost sounds like you're saying that the relationship is improving between the United Kingdom and France because of the weakness of Sunak and Macron.
Yes, that is exactly it.
If I could ask, Joseph, do you feel that that's the way you would analyse the situation?
Well, I think something that Anne's picked up on here that's really important is the broader European context. And I think that the end of the Merkel era in Germany has necessitated a rethinking of the political topography of the European continent. And also, we should not underestimate the unbelievable exogenous shock to the system as it was that the war in Ukraine has brought about. The 24th of February 2022 is going to go down in history as a moment which there was a before and then there is an after. And I think both the end of Merkel in Germany and the war in Ukraine has pushed Macron west. I think his orientation, he's seen that in Germany, he doesn't have the steadfast, strong economic superpower partner that he was hoping for. And I think he, like leaders in many European capitals, has been quite frustrated in Germany's reluctance to take a tough line on Russia in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And I think he's seen more of an alignment in terms of his position with the UK than he has seen perhaps with some of the more traditional French allies, i.e. namely Germany. We also see the rise of Poland as a key linchpin in the European geostrategic axis. I mean, we are seeing a generational change take place here, which I think paradoxically has pushed Paris to look a little bit more west than it would have done previously.
Well, slightly odd take on some of the things you're saying, if I may. Do you think it's helpful to France then that the United Kingdom had Brexit in this regard? Because, of course, if the United Kingdom was still inside the European Union, France would have an ally at its side that it could use as a sort of joint negotiator with Germany from within the European Union. With the United Kingdom outside the European Union, it has a joint player on the international stage that is a separate voice from the European Union. How does that play out for France? Is that a better thing or a worse thing?
No, definitely. But we have to also think from a security perspective that we're talking about a France that's in NATO as well as in the European Union. I think in terms of security, issues, the European Union is given a little bit more weight than it actually has, right? The main strategic alliance here we're talking about is NATO, and you know, France, the UK, and the US are the three big NATO partners that ensure that treaty alliance actually has teeth. I think also there's been a dawning realization in London, and we've seen this with a recent, quite remarkable actually, article in the Telegraph, which is, you know, the main kind of Tory newspaper in the UK that admitted Project Fear is a failure, shows that there's a dawning realization in Whitehall that something's got to change. We need to realign to be economically and politically closer to the EU in a way that I think many on the right of the Tory party didn't quite anticipate. Again, this is political dynamite in the UK. The public is not ready, right, to hear these voices. But I think this is something that is a realization in London, and we can see that was also a cause of warmth, right, in London to, you know, but make better relations with France and thus, by extension, the wider European Union.
Peter, both Joseph and Anne-Elizabeth have said that Ukraine is a seminal event. It's basically drawn a line in the sand. Everything that's happened after the Russians invaded Ukraine fully has completely changed relative to where we are now. Is that your position too?
Completely. There's been a palpable geopolitical shift to the Central and Eastern European and indeed Northern European states, frontline states. That's the first, and that has probably come about because of the vacuum in Berlin's leadership. And also the European Union has had quite a historic change of their destiny, if you like. It was all about Brexit and a member state leaving, and now we have a hero nation in the form of Ukraine. And, you know, occasionally Europe has its hero nations. Poland was the last one. And Europe has effectively been turbocharged, first of all, by, obviously, Ukraine, and secondly, because of the absence of the United Kingdom from the European Union's decision-making process. More integrationist projects like the COVID bond, which is a kind of Trojan horse for the Euro bond, have made Europe much more cohesive and more purposeful. I think it was just announced today that we do see, the European Union does see a membership between 30 and 36 over the next 20 years. And the polity of the European Union will be incredibly powerful, controlling the heartlands of Central Eastern Europe, which has, in international relations terms, as you'll tell me, is the key to power globally. So we have a situation now where Ukraine has transformed anything. Westlessness is over. Smart leaders have recognized the situation. Compromised leaders like Germany have fallen substantially behind. But I would just say one point back. I think the public are open to this debate in the United Kingdom. I think the craziness of the UK political system denies a political opportunity to discuss this. So you have essentially a banana monarchy where the political establishment cannot say what the public want them to say for fear of the power and influences in the United Kingdom, namely the press, and that part of the Conservative Party which is hooked up to finance capitalism.
Anne-Elizabeth.
So, you know, Sunak can't move.
Anne-Elizabeth, is that your take as well?
Well, apart from the fact that I think that blaming the press all the time is never a healthy attitude.
I think Anne-Elizabeth, I'm not talking about the whole press.
Well, no, it's in. I'm going to be sort of part of a group in that one.
It's okay. He doesn't mean TRT World.
No.
But I also think that Sunak can move more. And actually, possibly the only lesson he should take from Boris Johnson is that the public is perfectly aware when you're equivocating and essentially sort of trying to wriggle out of something that you don't want to take a decision on. And if he's very decisive, it will probably help him inside and abroad. It's very also interesting that the leadership of Britain is something that sort of raises people's sort of communal feeling together. And the only thing that has not helped Labour, because everything else has been going in the direction of the new sort of iteration of Labour that we've got now, is essentially the attitude in foreign policy. There's also the fact that, and we're going back to what Joseph was saying at the beginning, is that the two sort of standing armies that until February, the end of February, March, I would have said were the two significant armies in Europe are the French and the British one. But now we've realized that it is entirely likely that the Ukrainian army that rebuilt itself since 2014 is actually probably the best conventional army in Europe. And the second one is probably Poland, and that's really an interesting thing to see. The adaptability, the capacity to sort of react to things is something that is also teaching us things. And finally, we have a common enemy. We also have a common economic enemy. There's right now the Europeans are looking at how China is going to behave because we are forgetting the other partner. What we saw at the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, especially when all sorts of leaders, not necessarily the peoples, but leaders in the world decided that Russia should be sort of helped or at least left alone to do whatever it wanted. This is sort of disappearing, and I think out of this, an entirely new political situation exists in which there can be shown for the first time by the European Union a steadfast attitude.
Okay, but Macron has a fundamental problem in that if he looks around the European Union, who are his internal allies of any caliber, as it were? He's currently having a row with Italy. Germany is, I believe one of you described it as a vacuous state a few minutes ago. As he looks elsewhere, he's not going to find a strong ally up in Scandinavia. Probably Poland's his best bet at this point, isn't it? What do you do if you're Macron, you're looking for allies? Anne-Elizabeth, I'll ask you first, and then I'll cross to Joseph.
It is a pity that the few initiatives that Macron has taken in private and silently, for instance, between Azerbaijan and Armenia in a dire situation, are not known, but that any sort of almost spontaneous initiative about foreign main European nations has created a problem. It looks as if he's sort of going out of his way to make superficial adversaries, but in a way that makes it very difficult for those leaders to stand back and say, oh, we like the French anyway. He puts himself in that situation precisely because he's actually not a politician. He was never elected to anything before he became the president. He is a French civil servant, and they're very well known for this sort of short-cutting sort of judgments, undiplomatic, because they are within the French administration. They're sort of an expression of power. It doesn't work like this in diplomacy. And as I said, his successful diplomacy is silent, and his not successful diplomacy is incredibly visible.
Joseph, French witticisms may have undercut Macron. What are your feelings?
Oh, well, there's a lot I could say there, but I think something that's important when Macron looks around Europe, and I think this is where we have to be a little bit cautious, is Poland, for example, demonstrates the economic, demographic as well, and political ascension of many of the Central and Eastern European states. But it was only 6 or so months ago that the European Union itself was sanctioning Poland because of the erosion of certain kinds of rights, the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary.
And Hungary and
common.
Others. I mean, it
and Hungary and others, but no, totally. But we've never looked at Orban as a sort of potential linchpin of European security in the way that we're now looking at Poland. And this presents, some quite significant issues in that you can't make, a steady political ally out of a regime that you're also, with the other hand, sanctioning for eroding democracy and certain kinds of rights. So I think Macron finds himself in quite a lonely place. It's very interesting to see the new far-right leader of Italy took on to Italian television recently the Central African franc, which is a currency used in West Africa that's still controlled by France and printed in France itself, to take a jab at France and other European economic powers that she's accusing of undercutting economic development in Africa and thus causing mass migration to Italy. We've also seen Sweden take a swing to the right. So, Macron finds himself in a landscape with few friends.
Joseph Downing, Anne-Elizabeth Moutet, Peter Wilding, thank you very much for joining me. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just head over to YouTube and search for Roundtable TRT World. From me and from the entire team here, goodbye. Thank you for watching.